Welcome to BauTek Labs, where in tonight's episode we take this, an old NES Advantage, arguably one of the best retro controllers ever created, and upgrade it to this, the NES ProVantage. Well, for now it's got a new joystick, some new buttons, we'll give it a cool name later. And here's the NES Advantage we'll be working on here. Released in 1987, this was one of the greatest controllers that Nintendo has ever put out. You can see this poor thing here is broken at the joystick. Something my daughter managed to do when she was 2, despite these being built out of ancient Nintendium, a material which doesn't, break too often. I mean, just looking at old Game Boys that have been to hell and back that are still working, you can see how strong that used to be. Now that it broke, we've got a good chance here to improve this thing rather than toss it out or replace it. What made these so cool back in the day is the arcade stick, the 2 large buttons, and then you had the adjustable turbo here, which had the pots for adjustment of the rapid fire, and then toggle buttons to switch it on and off. It also had a rudimentary slow feature, which didn't always work. If a game had a start screen or a pause screen, it kind of screwed it up, but it's kind of a nice option to have there if you need it. With introductions out of the way, let's crack this bad boy open and take a look at what kind of space and electronics we'll be dealing with when we upgrade it. That came apart pretty easily, and there didn't seem to be any surprises left inside for us. I have pulled this one apart in the past after I snatched it up from the thrift store, so everything is pretty clean and is ready to go. Here's where it broke, where the joystick attaches to the base here. I thought about gluing or plastic welding it back together, but I'm worried it would just fall apart again, especially after some rigorous Mega Man sessions. Instead, we'll replace it with something better like this, just a cheapo eBay joystick that you can have for about $8 or so. It is quite a bit larger than the original joystick, it's got more depth to it and a pretty big mounting plate, so we'll definitely have to do some heavy modifications to make it fit. For buttons, we're going to try to squeeze these cherry blues in between the PCB and upper surface to replace the old squishy pads. Let's see how that goes and whether or not they'll fit. Slight change of plans on the button mounting. I did try them on the surface, but kind of as I feared, they were too tall and they stuck out of the enclosure. So I bit the bullet and I went ahead and cut the PCB and then just dropped them right in. So this way they fit perfectly. I did have to make some modifications. Here's what the bottom of one of the buttons looked like. We had to remove some of the flashing around and then shorten that center post a bit. But that works pretty well and their throw is perfect now. Now, because we did cut this, oh man, we had to reroute some of the PCB because, I went through about 7 or 8 traces, plus we had to run these buttons back to where they belong. We just used some jumper wire. It's quite bodgy, but you know what? It still works, and not like anybody's going to see it after I put it back together, right? Now that the buttons are done, I moved on to the joystick, and what I've done here is plastic welded the original nubbins back in. Basically, you just use an old soldering iron or tip, melt them back to the host plastic, and then I used a tie wrap, kind of like you would solder, and then just goobed it in there to give it a little more reinforcement. And I did that instead of running screws through, just because I didn't want to mar this beautiful, beautiful plastic surface here. So we'll see how well this holds up. I got a feeling it'll do okay. Now, we're not going to just rely on the hot glue either here to keep everything indexed. What I'm going to do is throw in some plywood. And that's actually got some of that squishy foam on the bottom so it sinks into these holes. And then on top of that, we just got a nice chunk of 1/8" aluminum, and that's going to compress that down and hopefully hold everything in place. Thought we'd take a detailed look at this before we slap it back in the Advantage and button it up. I'll put pictures of both front and back on this on the blog, just in case you want to mess around and make a schematic or just see how everything connects. That'll be there for you. So let's take a quick look. Here we've got your wires running down to the first and second player ports on the NES, and they'll stop by at this guy, which is a little 8-bit shift register, much like the one we used in the mech controller. So what happens is every time you push a button, it sets the corresponding bit in the shift register to a 1 or a 0, and then about 60 times a second the NES hits this little shift register up, pulls its data down through just serial communication, and then figures out which state each button is in, and then reacts accordingly. Up here you've got the turbo feature, which is what really makes an NES Advantage awesome. And that just comprises of turbo switch, LED, you've got the pot to adjust the rate, and this capacitor actually ties in with the pot to adjust the circuit. It runs through this guy here, which is a little hex inverter. It's just basically 6 NOT gates tied together, and it uses something called a relaxed oscillator, or relaxing oscillator, something like that, in order to, basically hammer the button over and over again with a square wave to give us that turbo feature. And then that square wave is adjusted by the pot in relation to this capacitor. I see I did nick one capacitor with the Dremel. Thankfully it's okay for now, but oops. Then we've got your slow button here. This just hits the start button very quickly using that same hex inverter and the same kind of thing. It is fixed though, the rate for that can't be adjusted. And then here's the switch to go between first player and single player. And what this does, it's a dual pole switch, and it just adjusts which controller port the clock and the data lines is connected to for that shift register. So there it is in all of its glory. Everything's ready for assembly. We've got the buttons, joystick, everything mounted there and working perfectly. And then we've got this just kind of hacked up piece of 1/2-inch MDF here that's going to make up for the extra gap or the extra length that this joystick takes out of the bottom. This is one of the first pieces I'm going to end up redoing when I get the CNC table finished. We'll give it a nice beveled edge on the inside where the original plate can ride, and it'll look better in general. I did leave this big hunk of MDF on here rather than hollowing this out, just because this joystick adds a lot of weight to the left side of the NES Advantage, and having this extra MDF actually counteracts that pretty well, so it balances out. So I'll get this stuff mounted up though, we'll see how it looks, and we'll do some playtesting. What started as a regular NES Advantage has now transformed, thanks to some naughty children, into dun dun dun, the ProVantage, or FrankenVantage, considering all the bodging and PCB cutting we had to do. But you know what? It works great. Just did some Mega Man 3 and beat the crap out of it thanks to this. The new Sanwa style joystick is awesome, especially compared to the old squish pad, which if you remember, the underside of this is really just a big D-pad. So, not the greatest. The new Cherry MX buttons are great as well. What I might do though in the future, instead of using those, is something like this. This is one of the Cherry switches out of the arcade machine. These work really, really awesome for these style of buttons. The blues are, they're made more for maybe a keyboard and aren't perfect for buttons, but still a lot better than these squishy old bits here. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the rebuild of that NES Advantage as much as I did. It's always nice to fix something like that rather than throw it away. Coming up, I'm going to have some updates on the mech simulator. We've done a rebuild with that with all new aluminum components, dual joysticks, new controller software, so that's working fantastic. We're also going to do some more updates on the CNC router and the laser table. We're coming along on that. And aside from that, we are also going to build a Kessel Delta 3D printer as well. I've got the parts on order, so we should be getting a lot of that in soon. I'm actually trying to keep the build price under $350, so we'll see how that goes, and I'll post more details as we go along. Have a good one until then.